Slavery. The word itself carries an immense weight of suffering, injustice, and inhumanity. It's a stain on human history, a system that has cast a shadow over millennia. From the earliest civilizations to the present day, the institution of slavery has exploited and dehumanized millions of people. Understanding its roots and persistent presence is crucial to recognizing its lasting impact and working towards its complete eradication. Throughout history, powerful forces have sought to justify slavery. However, at its very core, slavery represents a brutal denial of fundamental human rights. This documentary delves deep into the history of slavery and its devastating consequences. We will explore the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, the inspiring rise of abolitionist movements, and the harsh reality of modern slavery. Finally, we will examine the ongoing global efforts to combat this scourge and the collective responsibility we all share. The origins of slavery are deeply intertwined with the emergence of civilization itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, slavery was already a well-established practice. Debt bondage was common. Ancient Egypt relied on slave labor. Slaves were used in agriculture, construction, and domestic service. They were considered property. The grand monuments of the pharaohs stand as reminders of the human cost of forced labor. In ancient Greece, slavery was an integral part of the economy and society. Athens relied on slave labor. Philosophers like Aristotle attempted to justify slavery. The Roman Empire institutionalized slavery. Roman slaves worked in mines, plantations, and homes. The brutal treatment of slaves in Roman society was well documented. The Middle Ages saw a shift in the nature of slavery, although it remained a widespread institution. In Europe, feudalism emerged, a hierarchical system where serfs were tied to the land they worked. While not technically slaves, serfs had limited freedom and were obligated to provide labor and goods to their lords. The Islamic world, during its expansion, developed its own systems of slavery. The Islamic slave trade, while subject to certain religious and ethical guidelines, facilitated the movement of slaves from Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. These slaves served various roles, from domestic servants to soldiers. In Asia, various forms of slavery and forced labor persisted. The caste system in India, for example, included groups relegated to hereditary servitude. China practiced forms of debt bondage and penal slavery. Despite variations in practice, the underlying principle of one human being owning another endured. The transatlantic slave trade, which would emerge in the following centuries, would cast an even darker shadow over the history of slavery. The slave trade, a new world built on slavery. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most abhorrent chapters in human history. Driven by the insatiable demand for labor in the newly colonized Americas, European powers, particularly Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, engaged in the systematic capture, transport, and enslavement of millions of Africans. The Middle Passage, the perilous journey across the Atlantic Ocean, was a living nightmare for those crammed into the holds of slave ships. Disease, malnutrition, and brutal treatment were rampant, leading to the deaths of countless Africans before they even reached the Americas. Upon arrival, enslaved Africans were subjected to a life of toil on plantations that produced crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Conditions were brutal, with long workdays, harsh punishments, and little regard for their humanity. The wealth generated by these plantations fueled the economies of European powers and contributed significantly to the development of the Americas. Voices of freedom, abolition, and its aftermath. The 18th century saw the emergence of abolitionist movements which challenged the morality and legitimacy of slavery. Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau championed natural rights and human equality. In Great Britain, figures like William Wilberforce led the fight against the slave trade. In the United States, the abolitionist movement gained momentum with figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. The American Civil War resulted in the abolition of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. However, the legacy of slavery persisted, casting a long shadow. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. Economic and social inequalities persisted, and the fight for racial justice continues to this day. Modern shackles, the new faces of slavery. Despite the official abolition of slavery in most of the world, millions of people are still trapped in various forms of modern slavery. Human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and the exploitation of child labor are contemporary manifestations of this age-old scourge. The International Labour Organization estimates that over 40 million people are victims of modern slavery. Often these individuals are lured by false promises of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in exploitative situations with little hope of escape. The globalized economy, with its complex supply chains and demand for cheap labor, creates conditions ripe for exploitation. Industries such as agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and domestic work are particularly vulnerable to modern slavery practices. A shared fight towards a world without slavery. The fight against slavery is far from over. It requires a concerted global effort to address the root causes of modern slavery, including poverty, discrimination, lack of access to education, and inadequate law enforcement. International organizations like the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, and numerous NGOs are working to combat modern slavery through legislation, awareness campaigns, victim support services, and efforts to dismantle trafficking networks. Consumers also have a crucial role to play by demanding transparency and ethical sourcing practices from businesses. By supporting businesses committed to fair labor practices, consumers can help create a marketplace that does not profit from exploitation. The road to a world without slavery is long and challenging. It requires a collective commitment to justice, equality, and the inherent dignity of all human beings. By learning from the mistakes of the past and actively combating modern forms of slavery, we can strive to create a future where every individual is free from exploitation and has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and respect. Thanks for watching. Now subscribe, comment, follow us for more episodes and share this video. See you next time. Magic World by RGP Films.